God be upon my mind, upon my lips, and upon my heart, that I should do the gospel. Well, I believe with Dostoevsky that beauty will save the world. In the book The Idiot, he makes this remarkable statement. For those who don't know, Dostoevsky was born to a devout Russian Orthodox family in the mid-19th century. But he experienced a lot of tragedy and heartache. When he was young, his childhood best friend was abused and murdered. Later on, as he got involved politically, he ended up spending 12 years in prison. And he witnessed countless atrocities. The man had a hard, hard life. And so it's hard to believe that anyone who has suffered so much could say something so profound. Beauty will save the world. Usually when we go through that kind of heartache, we stop believing in beauty. But I believe he's right. Beauty will save the world. And of course, I'm not talking about the beauty of a dazzling sunset or the mountains of fire and orange and cornelian and gold. I'm talking about the beauty we find in the face of Jesus Christ. Yet, it seems that today beauty has been torn away from us. It's clear the world's not at ease. War in Gaza and Ukraine. Violence even here recently in the hospital. Unceasing waves of the profane beat upon us through media. It seems that the beauty has been torn away from us. Now, one of my favorite theologians is Hans Urs von Balthasar, a Catholic theologian of the 20th century. And he makes a rather long quote. I'm going to save you most of it because it's pretty dense. But he finishes by saying, the witness borne by being becomes untrustworthy with a person who can no longer read the language of beauty. A really profound statement. Of course, it's part of a larger discourse, as I said. To simplify it a little bit, we might say that when beauty is made profane, we lose our very selves, we lose our being. We become little more than a lump of flesh to be cut and modified, maybe to satisfy the social anxieties of the people around us. And in the process, we lose our very selves. If you look beyond the media that inures or normalizes you to the profane, you will find a society that has put beauty to death every day, and our souls are dying with it. One place that this comes into sharp focus is in the unhappiness and despair, in particular, of our mothers and daughters. And I want to focus on that a little bit. Of course, men are not immune. Men suffer too from this. In fact, the suicide rate for men is about 4 times that of women right now. But women suffer differently, and I want to recognize that today. I want to recognize the burden that you ladies experience in a world that sacrifices beauty. And of course, I'm not talking about mere outward beauty. We're talking about moral beauty. In the reading from Matthew, Jesus is met by a ruler of the local synagogue whose daughter has just died. We read, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And suddenly, a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, "If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well." So we have a dying daughter and a woman who's got this flow of blood for 12 years. This devout man shows incredible faith in Jesus to come to him even though his daughter's already died. If you stop and look at the passage, it's clear he's left a grieving household where the family and concerned friends are gathered. The funeral arrangements are made, and professional mourners and musicians are doing their thing. Imagine leaving that terminal situation with the sort of confidence that could say, "Just lay your hand on her and she will live." It would be like getting up and leaving in the middle of a wake and inviting Jesus back to raise the body. What did he see in Jesus to make him believe that beauty could save his world, that Christ could save his world? In the account in St. Luke, the same story is rendered a little bit differently. Jesus gets up to go to the man's home, and as he does, he's surrounded by a crowd of people. And there's a woman in the crowd who's had a continuous flow of blood for 12 years. Now that probably would have made her unclean by Jewish standards. She would have been living in some way or another like an outcast. And yet it seems that she had some kind of funds and monies. And we learned there that she spent all her money on doctors for 12 years and still could not be healed. Imagine living with the stigma, the heartache, the loneliness, the despair all of those years. So trying not to draw attention to herself, she comes up behind Jesus and grasps the tassel of his shawl, which would have been pretty low, I think. And like the synagogue ruler, she thinks to herself, if I but touch the fringe of the shawl, surely I will be healed. What is it about Jesus that gives them this kind of confidence? When she touches his shawl, immediately it says in the Lucan account, Jesus feels the power drawn out from him, and he asks, who touched me? And so she explains herself. And his reply to her is, take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And it says she's healed at the very moment. It's a beautiful picture of God's grace. After that, he continues and arrives at the ruler's house where weeping women stood by wagging their heads, and hired mourners and musicians play their dirge, and where hushed voices hang in the air, pierced by wailing. Into this world of grief and sorrow, perpetual heartache, our Christ strides in. The Lord of life, before whom all are alive. He tells them, make room, for the girl is not dead, but asleep. And he makes the mourners leave the house. Those who can no longer read the language of beauty meet him with ridicule. They cannot recognize life, even when life steps into the room. Their unbelief is, of course, of no use to Jesus. He wants that unbelief out of the house. So after he's ushered them all outside, Jesus takes the girl by the hand and raises her up. It says, arise. And the little girl is raised, and beauty saves the world. I have a friend who leads a women's ministry in Charleston, and she's told me about the crisis that exists down there with many of the women that she ministers to. Most of those women are churched, by the way. There's churches on every corner. That's why they call it the Holy City. Unlike the Northeast, most people still go to church there. We're in one of the least church states in the country. We vie with Vermont for number 1 or number 2. These 3 states, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, yeah, we're at the bottom of the list. But she tells me many of these women are not emotionally well. They're frazzled, they're distressed, they're anxious, they're burdened. It seems like their worlds are flying apart, and they have perpetually bleeding hearts. Perpetually in a state of anguish, fear, and despair. Because ours is a society that has abandoned the good and the beautiful. That's what I would maintain. Of course, they're not alone. Women everywhere, I think, suffer like this, whether they go to church or not. Well, why is that? Our mothers and daughters and wives live at the mercy of a debased world, stripped of moral and spiritual beauty. Every day, you women, I think, and I want to honor this and recognize it, must face the gut-wrenching news of war and political infighting, of gun violence, of tens of thousands of mothers and families who brave the worst conditions to enter the country illegally, of veterans who are displaced and disrespected. They're told a lie that for their daughters or sons to live, they must deny their innate beauty and exchange it for the beauty of another body, one they could never really have. Our mothers and daughters are under constant moral threat and are in anguish. And that there's a little bit of a difference between the way us guys and you women deal with that. Women are nurturers by nature. It's profoundly unsettling to live in a world like that. They want their family to be safe. They want people to be safe and happy. They want to make their home beautiful and feather the nest. They delight in making people around them happy. This is why we love you so. But no mother can see war in Gaza and not feel for the mothers there. No woman can see a train of pregnant girls with 5-year-old children in tow crossing a river to get through a barbed wire fence and not feel some sense of despair. Few women can look at the political and social injustices that threaten their home and safety and not feel the urge to somehow get up and do something. But all of this creates a perpetually bleeding heart. The household America is crowded with professional mourners and flute players, mourning friends and neighbors who, I'll say it like the women, for example, on The View, take a sadistic pleasure in rehearsing how bad everything is and dole out bad advice like Job's counselors. Miserable people can't stand to be with people who are not miserable and insist on bringing them down to their own level. The result is mothers who are emotionally hemorrhaging and can't find healing, who spend money on psychiatrists or booze or spiritual healers and incense or on even affairs or distractions and find no beauty in the world. We have to get up and leave that house of disaster. And I weep for our daughters. I have 3 sons. I'd love to see them get married. But what they experience and what we find are daughters who are in a constant state of anxiety, self-loathing, questioning their identity, and doubting their beauty. Now boys are their competitors and liabilities and enemies instead of potential partners in building the beauty of a loving family. These perhaps are the unintended consequences of feminism that have created a landscape of violence and isolation, misery and rejection. A world robbed of a certain kind of beauty. And that's tragic. And it's ruining us. To go back to Hans Urs von Balthasar, he said, without beauty, what remains is then a mere lump of existence which, even if it claims for itself the freedom proper to spirits, in other words, proper to souls, nevertheless remains totally dark and incomprehensible even to itself. In other words, we can't even understand ourselves in this kind of climate. The witness borne by being becomes untrustworthy for the person who can no longer read the language of beauty. How can I trust what goes on around me? How can I trust the world? How can I make my way in the world when my very being becomes untrustworthy because we can no longer read the language of beauty? I know these are high-minded ideas. We're talking about deep, fundamental consequences or aspects of what it means to be human, what it means to be foundational in our being. But what he's trying to say is that when we lose grip of what is beautiful, what is good, moral purity and moral beauty, we lose ourselves and we suffer for it. And our society is suffering for this. A society that can no longer read the language of beauty will kill it in their daughters and bleed it out in their mothers and make us little more than a lump of flesh to be cut and modified to satisfy the social anxieties of a sick society. Why is it that we can no longer read the language of beauty? What happened? What happened to our society that brought us to this place? Well, I would tell you that it's because beauty resides in God. And the society that rejects God gradually loses any sense of beauty and therefore being. According to von Balthasar, we lose our very selves. If we're going to be healed, we must return to the beauty of God. In Colossians, we have a beautiful passage, and it's just one of many, because the reality is our faith floods the world with beauty. But we read, he has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. What a beautiful idea. He's delivered us from darkness, this lack of being, and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. The deliverance from this ugly darkness is in the image of God the Son. For the very next passage says this: he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or powers or principalities. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things consist. He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. That's where beauty comes from. This captivating vision of Christ, our God. The synagogue ruler and the woman with the flow of blood were healed by that one thing, one person, Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. They were captivated by a vision of beauty, not the sort of beauty that exists in museums, of course, but the beauty that exists in goodness and truth, which were on display in the words and acts of Jesus. Jesus is beautiful. Jesus is beautiful. It says that he is the exact image of God. The word there is icon. Many years ago, when I was, we went through a stage and I was reading a lot of Orthodox material, and I fell in love with icons. And we ended up having icons everywhere, all over my house, especially in the living room. We had icons everywhere, Orthodox icons. And of course, they were less for us an aspect of devotion at that time than just things of beauty and religious significance. But they were meaningful, and if you get an icon, and I would encourage you to have some icons in your house, by the way. If you have some icons, they are written, they're not painted. They are spoken, they are a painted sermon. And if you look at an icon and pay attention to the details, you'll find God speaking to you. And Jesus is the same way. And our room was filled with these icons, and my daughter had her sweet 16th birthday, and all of her friends were over. And where did they sit? In the Jesus room. With icons of Christ staring at them the whole time. Some of them were put off. One or two of them were converted. Jesus is the icon, the exact image of God. God exists in resplendent beauty, and we see the beauty of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We can't go to other gods like 1,000 other doctors to heal our sick condition. We too often give lip service to Christ as God, but only like good pantheists do. We hold Jesus as God next to 1,000 other gods. Gods of comfort, safety, money, pleasure, other spiritual features or techniques. And we're quick to run after them, like the woman who ran after all of the other doctors. But our hearts are not healed by running to these other gods. We can spend all we have on these remedies, but until we see the beauty of God in the face of Jesus Christ, we will continue in the darkness of a world without the beauty of God. Beauty and the sacredness of being are essential and are grounded in the moral purity and beauty of God. And when the church surrenders these, it sacrifices being itself. And we cease to thrive in earth. Icons, like I said, are meant to be looked at in wonder, where the image speaks to the heart. And we are meant to look at the Son of God and see the moral beauty and perfection of our Creator. We're meant to gaze upon that love because only that love and beauty will save us. The moment a society catches a glimpse of the good and beautiful, it's raised by the hand from the bed of despair. When we are captured by a vision of just how good and beautiful God is, our anxieties, our gushing anguish, our striving ceases, and faith emerges in the heart. Hope. A hope that comes up to touch the hem of his garment, even when it feels like all hope is lost. I find the words of this gospel tremendously encouraging, because even when it looks like things are dead, Christ comes and says, "Arise." And no matter what you see out in the culture, I believe that this is what Jesus is saying to our mothers, to our daughters, arise, and to our sons, and to our husbands. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all.
closing hymn is hymn 517. Hymn 517.